Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today, we're taking a step back from the Thanksgiving table to dive into the real story behind this holiday. I'm not here to talk about turkey or mashed potatoes. Instead, I want to unpack the origins of Thanksgiving, the history most of us weren't taught in school. If you grew up hearing the sweet, simple story of pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a meal in harmony, buckle up and let's take a step back. Before the Pilgrims, before Plymouth Rock, and before any mention of Thanksgiving as we know it today. To really understand the origins of Thanksgiving and the historical context around it, we first have to look at the Native American tribes who lived on this land long before European settlers ever arrived. Specifically, let's talk about the Wampanoag people and the broader Indigenous world that existed in what is now New England. Disclaimer: the information shared in this video is based on historical research and accounts regarding the origins of Thanksgiving and its broader implications. While every effort has been made to ensure accuracy, interpretations of history can vary depending on sources and perspectives. This video is intended to encourage awareness, critical thinking, and respectful dialogue about the holiday's history and its impact. It is not meant to disrespect anyone's traditions or personal beliefs about Thanksgiving. Viewers are encouraged to conduct their own research and explore diverse viewpoints to form a well-rounded understanding. So, who were the Native American tribes living in the area before the Europeans arrived? Well, the Wampanoag people were one of many indigenous groups living in what is now Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and the surrounding areas. Their name, Wampanoag, means people of the first light, which is a beautiful acknowledgement of their land being among the first to see the sunrise in the United States. They were not a small or isolated group. Historians estimate that the Wampanoag Confederacy consisted of about 40 distinct tribes, each with its own sachem or leader. The Wampanoag were part of a rich, interconnected network of native nations that spanned across the continent. Nearby tribes included the Narragansett, Pequot, Mohegan, and Nipmuc, among others. Each had its own language, traditions, and systems of governance. Now, what were the cultural, social, and political structures of the Wampanoag and other tribes? The Wampanoag people had a deeply rooted culture that emphasized harmony with nature, collective responsibility, and balance within their communities. Their society was organized into a matrilineal structure, meaning lineage and inheritance were traced through the mother's side. Women played incredibly important roles, not only in family life, but also in decision-making. While men were primarily responsible for hunting, fishing, and warfare, women oversaw farming and managed the distribution of food. Both genders had distinct but equally valued roles, creating a sense of balance in their society. At the head of each Wampanoag tribe was the sachem, a leader who was more like a mediator than a ruler. Sachems made decisions in collaboration with a council of advisors, and their authority was based on respect and consensus rather than brute force or hierarchy. Larger issues, such as disputes between tribes or alliances, were handled through diplomacy, often involving gift-giving or ceremonies to maintain relationships. These systems were incredibly sophisticated, far from the simplistic, uncivilized stereotypes that were later perpetuated by European settlers. Spiritually, the Wampanoag people and many other tribes had a profound connection to the land and believed in the interconnectedness of all living things. They practiced ceremonies to honor the cycles of nature. Planting, harvesting, and hunting were all accompanied by rituals of gratitude. The concept of ownership over land, as Europeans understood it, was foreign to them. Instead, they viewed themselves as stewards of the earth, with a responsibility to care for it for future generations. So, how did they sustain themselves? The Wampanoag, like many other indigenous peoples, were masters of sustainable living. Their diet was diverse and seasonally based. Agriculture played a huge role in their sustenance, with corn, or maize, being the cornerstone of their diet. Corn wasn't just food, it was central to their way of life. They practiced the Three Sisters method of farming, which involved planting corn, beans, and squash together. This wasn't just clever, it was ecologically brilliant. The corn provided a natural pole for the beans to climb, the beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, and the squash spread along the ground, keeping weeds at bay and retaining moisture. This kind of intercropping wasn't just efficient, it was a testament to their deep understanding of agriculture and ecology. Beyond farming, hunting, and fishing were also crucial. Wampanoag men would hunt deer, turkey, and other game, often using bows, arrows, and traps they crafted themselves. Fishing was a key food source, especially since their territory included rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters. They used nets, weirs, and spears to catch fish like cod and herring, as well as shellfish like clams and oysters. During certain times of the year, they would also harvest eels, which were considered a delicacy. Nothing went to waste. Every part of the animal was used for food, tools, or clothing. And let's not forget trade. The Wampanoag people were part of a vibrant trade network that spanned across regions. They traded wampum, beads made from shells, which were not just decorative but also carried deep symbolic and cultural meaning. Wampum was used in ceremonies and as a way to record important agreements or events. The Wampanoag also traded goods like furs, corn, and tobacco with neighboring tribes, fostering relationships and alliances. The way they lived was based on balance, not overusing resources, taking only what was needed, and ensuring the survival of their community for generations to come. Contrast that with what happens after colonization, and you can start to see how the arrival of European settlers disrupted this balance. So, when we talk about Thanksgiving, we can't forget that it's rooted in the land and the people who lived here long before 1620. The Wampanoag people had thriving communities, advanced farming techniques, and intricate political systems long before they ever encountered Europeans. Their generosity and knowledge were instrumental in helping the Pilgrims survive their first harsh winter. But as we'll explore further, that relationship came at a significant cost to Indigenous communities. Understanding this pre-colonial context isn't just about history. It's about recognizing the deep, rich cultures that were already here and respecting the resilience of the Indigenous people who are still here today. It's a reminder that the first Thanksgiving didn't mark the beginning of this land's story. It was just one moment in a much larger, complex history that we should all strive to understand. Now, let's dive into the period of European contact. When and how did Europeans first make contact with the Native Americans in New England? The first known contact between Europeans and the indigenous people of what is now the United States occurred long before the Pilgrims arrived. Starting in the early 1500s, European explorers began making their way across the Atlantic. The first encounters in New England specifically came through explorers like John Cabot, who was likely one of the first Europeans to land on the North American coast in 1497. This early contact wasn't the peaceful encounters we might be taught about in school, though. These first exchanges were mostly about trade and exploration, and the Europeans' arrival was not always welcomed by the native communities. The Wampanoag, for example, had already encountered European fishermen in the coastal waters off their shores, who came for the rich fishing grounds, long before the Pilgrims arrived. The bigger, more impactful wave of European exploration began when the English and the French began to establish permanent colonies in the early 1600s. The English specifically started setting up settlements along the eastern coast of what would become the United States, with Jamestown in 1607 being one of the first, followed by Plymouth in 1620. The arrival of these settlers would mark the beginning of a massive and devastating shift for Native American populations. Now, what was the impact of early European exploration on native populations? The arrival of Europeans was catastrophic for many Native American tribes, both directly and indirectly. Let's start with disease. The spread of diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles had a horrific effect on indigenous communities. Native people had no immunity to these foreign diseases, and they spread like wildfire. The Wampanoag and other tribes saw entire villages wiped out by diseases long before they had any direct contact with settlers. It's estimated that up to 90% of some native populations were decimated by disease in the decades following European arrival. These diseases were unintentional, but the devastation they caused was far-reaching. Then there's displacement. As European settlers established more and more colonies, the Native Americans were pushed further and further off their ancestral lands. What was once open land used for hunting, fishing, and farming became colonized and enclosed. And with this displacement came violence. Early European settlers often viewed the land as theirs to claim and cultivate, disregarding the established ways of life of the native populations. The Wampanoag, for example, watched their land being taken and their way of life disrupted, leading to conflicts over land, resources, and sovereignty. This displacement wasn't a one-off incident. It would continue throughout the centuries, forcing Native peoples into smaller and smaller areas, resulting in the loss of their culture, independence, and connection to the land. And this leads us to the events that led the Pilgrims to leave England and settle in Plymouth. The Pilgrims, or Separatists as they were known, were a group of English Protestants who had broken away from the Church of England. They were facing persecution in England for their religious beliefs, and their desire to practice their faith freely was one of the driving forces behind their decision to leave. The Pilgrims first fled to the Netherlands in 1608, seeking religious freedom. However, they struggled to adapt to the Dutch way of life and felt their children were becoming too Dutchified. So, in 1620, they set their sights on a new land, what they called the New World. The Pilgrims, seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity, eventually set sail aboard the Mayflower, landing in what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts, in December 1620. They had initially intended to settle near the Hudson River in present-day New York, but poor weather and navigational issues forced them further north to the shores of Plymouth. The land they arrived at wasn't unoccupied, though. The region was home to indigenous peoples like the Wampanoag, who had already been living on the land for centuries. The Pilgrims weren't the first Europeans to land in this area, but they were among the first to attempt to settle and colonize it. When they arrived, they were ill-prepared for the harsh winter. They had limited supplies and faced challenges with farming, building shelters, and finding food. In this time of struggle, the Wampanoag, led by Chief Massasoit, came into play. In a key moment in the early days of Plymouth Colony, the Wampanoag people formed an alliance with the Pilgrims. Chief Massasoit understood that the Pilgrims could be potential allies against rival tribes in the region. He offered them food and assistance, teaching them how to plant crops like corn and fish in the nearby rivers, which helped them survive their first brutal winter. This was a moment of cooperation, yes, but it was also a moment of political calculation. The Wampanoag were seeking allies in a volatile region, and this alliance helped the Pilgrims stay alive and eventually thrive. However, while the Pilgrims were receiving help from the Wampanoag, they also didn't fully understand the broader impact of their presence on the land and the indigenous people who had been living there for centuries. And while the Thanksgiving feast in 1621 was a moment of shared celebration, it's important to remember that this was also the beginning of a long, painful chapter for Native peoples. Over time, as more settlers arrived, tensions would rise, and the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag would shift dramatically. In the years following the Pilgrims' arrival, the European population continued to grow, and with it came the expansion of European influence. More settlers meant more demands on land, more disease, and more conflicts with native populations. As the Pilgrims' colony expanded, they began to encroach on Wampanoag land and resources, which ultimately led to the breakdown of the alliance. The Wampanoag would face increasing pressure from both the Pilgrims and other European settlers, and the peace that existed between the two groups would ultimately shatter. So, to recap, the Pilgrims left England for religious freedom and economic opportunity, but their arrival in Plymouth wasn't as much of an isolated, peaceful moment as we often think. It was part of a broader story of European colonization that had deep, lasting impacts on the native populations of New England. From the first contact with European explorers in the 1500s to the arrival of the Pilgrims in 1620, these events set the stage for a complex and often painful history of coexistence, conflict, and survival for Native American communities. By understanding the reality of European contact, we can begin to see how the seeds of Thanksgiving and the darker side of its history were planted. This isn't just about the Pilgrims' story. It's about how their arrival impacted the indigenous people who had been living on this land for thousands of years, and the consequences of that impact still reverberate today. Now, let's dive into what actually happened during the so-called First Thanksgiving in 1621. The story we often hear is one of a peaceful gathering, where the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag came together to celebrate a successful harvest, sharing food and goodwill. But if we look beyond the simplified version of the tale, we see that the First Thanksgiving wasn't just a spontaneous, friendly feast. It was a more complex event with underlying survival needs and political motives. The feast took place after the Pilgrims had managed to survive their first brutal winter in Plymouth, largely thanks to the help of the Wampanoag people. As I mentioned earlier, the Wampanoag, led by Chief Massasoit, had assisted the Pilgrims by teaching them essential agricultural practices, like planting corn and fishing, and they had shared food with them during times of great hardship. In the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims had a bountiful harvest, and to celebrate their newfound survival, they invited the Wampanoag to join them in a feast. So, technically, this event was a celebration of the Pilgrims' survival, but it was also more than just a casual gathering. It was about forming and solidifying an alliance. The Wampanoag, as much as they were helping the Pilgrims, were also securing their own position. They sought alliances with the Pilgrims to strengthen their hold against rival tribes, and this Thanksgiving feast was in part a political gesture. The Wampanoag's participation in the event wasn't simply out of goodwill. It was strategically motivated. Now, when it comes to the nature of the Pilgrims' relationship with the Wampanoag, it's crucial to understand that their alliance was based on mutual benefit. But it wasn't necessarily a bond of friendship or cultural exchange in the way we think of it today. The Pilgrims were in a vulnerable position after their rough first winter, and they needed assistance to survive. The Wampanoag, on the other hand, were looking for allies to help them with growing tensions and conflicts with rival tribes in the region, particularly the Narragansett tribe. The alliance was rooted in survival. Both groups had something to gain, but it was also transactional. It wasn't a friendship born out of shared values or mutual respect, but rather one based on necessity and political calculation. So, was the first Thanksgiving a celebration of friendship, or were there political and survival motives behind it? The truth is that it was likely a bit of both. On the surface, it was a celebration of the Pilgrims' survival, but underneath it, it was an important moment for both sides to strengthen their positions. The Pilgrims needed the Wampanoag for food and guidance, while the Wampanoag needed the Pilgrims as potential allies against other tribes. The feast itself lasted for 3 days, and it was not the sit-down dinner with turkey and cranberry sauce that we imagine today. The food served were quite different, with wild fowl, venison, corn, beans, squash, and fish among the dishes. There was also no pumpkin pie or stuffing, as many of the ingredients we associate with modern Thanksgiving hadn't been introduced yet. What about the accuracy of the story we're taught in schools? The truth is, much of what we learn about the first Thanksgiving is a sanitized, oversimplified version of the events. Schools often teach the narrative of a harmonious gathering between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, focusing on the feast and the idea of giving thanks. But this narrative leaves out a lot of important context, especially the political and survival motives behind the event. It doesn't mention the complicated relationship between the two groups, nor does it acknowledge that this alliance was a means of survival rather than an emblem of peace and friendship. The first Thanksgiving in 1621 is often presented as the start of a story of peaceful coexistence, but in reality, it was just a brief moment in the larger, more complex history of Native Pilgrim relations. While it is true that the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims did share a meal and helped each other survive, this event was far from the idyllic scene of mutual respect and friendship that is often portrayed. It was a politically charged gathering that reflected the complicated dynamics of survival, power, and alliance building in a time of deep uncertainty and intertribal conflict. Furthermore, the outcome of this early alliance didn't last long. Over time, as more European settlers arrived, the dynamics between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, and later, the broader European colonial powers, shifted. The Pilgrims, along with other settlers, began to encroach on Wampanoag land and resources, leading to increasing tensions. What began as a brief moment of cooperation would soon be overshadowed by violence, conflict, and the loss of land and life for Native people. This is the part of the story that is often left out of the Thanksgiving narrative we're taught in school. The way Thanksgiving is taught in schools often glosses over the long-term effects of European colonization on Native populations, and the broader history of colonization that would unfold in the years following the 1621 feast. The real story of Thanksgiving is far more complicated, with moments of cooperation, but also moments of loss, betrayal, and violence. It's important to recognize that the first Thanksgiving wasn't just the beginning of a shared history of peace between Native Americans and Pilgrims, but rather the beginning of a long and painful process of colonization that would have devastating consequences for Indigenous communities. So, as we reflect on Thanksgiving and its origins, it's crucial to acknowledge the full story, the good, the bad, and the complicated. The story of the first Thanksgiving is just one chapter in a much larger and more complex history, and it's important to understand it in its proper context, with all of its nuances, rather than the simplistic narrative that is often taught in schools. By doing so, we can begin to have a more honest and informed conversation about Thanksgiving and its true origins. Let's take a closer look at how relationships between settlers and Native Americans evolved after 1621. While the first Thanksgiving may have marked a brief moment of cooperation between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, it didn't take long for these initial peaceful relations to deteriorate as European colonization expanded. As more settlers arrived in the New World, tensions grew over land, resources, and differing ways of life. The Pilgrims were not the only group of Europeans seeking to settle in the area, and soon Plymouth Colony was joined by other English colonies, each claiming more land and pushing farther into native territories. The arrival of more Europeans meant more demands on the land that Native Americans had lived on for thousands of years. The settlers brought new diseases, like smallpox, that devastated indigenous populations, and their growing settlements often resulted in the displacement of native communities. The land disputes and the settlers' desire for more territory led to conflicts that became increasingly violent over time. The Wampanoag and other native tribes found themselves in a difficult position, often trying to maintain some form of peace or alliance with the settlers, while also protecting their land and way of life. In particular, the situation with the Wampanoag began to deteriorate in the years after the 1621 feast. By the 1630s, the Pilgrims' need for land was growing, and they began encroaching on Wampanoag territory, which led to tensions. The relationship became more strained as the Wampanoag realized that the promises of alliance with the Pilgrims were not going to protect them from the encroaching settlers. The Pilgrims, with their rapidly expanding population, began pushing farther into native lands, disrupting the traditional hunting and farming territories that had sustained native communities for centuries. This brings us to the Pequot War of 1637, a significant conflict that illustrates the increasingly violent nature of relationships between settlers and Native Americans. The Pequot War was a violent struggle between the Pequot tribe and an alliance of English settlers from Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Connecticut colonies, along with their Native American allies, including the Mohegan and Narragansett tribes. The war was sparked by competition over control of trade routes, land, and resources, but it became a devastating event for the Pequot people. The Pequot War saw widespread violence, including massacres and the near total destruction of the Pequot tribe. The most notorious event of the war was the Mystic Massacre, where English soldiers, along with their native allies, attacked a Pequot village at dawn, killing between 300 to 700 men, women, and children. The survivors were either killed or enslaved, and their land was seized by the colonists. The aftermath of the war is chilling. Following their victory, the English colonists declared a day of Thanksgiving to celebrate their triumph over the Pequot people. In fact, this concept of a day of Thanksgiving didn't just refer to gratitude for harvests or the cooperation of Indigenous people. It was also a celebration of violence and conquest. The colonists marked the massacre of an entire tribe as a victory and a cause for celebration. This Thanksgiving was not about peaceful cooperation or friendship. It was about the violent expansion of European colonialism. The irony here is stark. What began as a Thanksgiving for survival in 1621 soon evolved into a day where colonists celebrated the destruction and near erasure of an entire Indigenous people. The Pequot War was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern of violence and displacement that characterized European colonization in North America. As more settlers arrived, land disputes and conflicts over resources became more common, leading to further bloodshed. The concept of a day of Thanksgiving was now linked to the violent subjugation of Native peoples, a stark contrast to the peaceful narrative often told about the holiday. Now, let's talk about how colonization, land disputes, and violence affected native populations over time. The Pequot War was just one example of how European settlers aggressively expanded their territories. But it was by no means the last conflict. Over the next several decades, European settlers would continue to push westward, taking more land from Native Americans and driving them from their ancestral territories. The arrival of new settlers, each bringing more diseases and more demand for land, led to the devastation of indigenous populations. The death toll from diseases like smallpox, to which Native Americans had no immunity, was staggering. Estimates suggest that between 75 to 90% of the indigenous population was wiped out by European diseases in the first century of contact. Beyond disease, native populations were also subjected to violence and forced relocation. As settlers expanded, they imposed treaties that often benefited the Europeans, not the native peoples. These treaties were frequently broken, and the land that Native Americans had lived on for thousands of years was taken, sometimes through force, sometimes through manipulative or unfair agreements. The violence and displacement didn't stop with the Pequot War. Over the centuries, there were numerous other conflicts, including King Philip's War in 1675, which saw brutal fighting between the Wampanoag and English settlers. The forced relocation of Native Americans also became widespread. By the 1830s, the U.S. government initiated policies that pushed Native Americans further west, often to reservations, in what became known as the Trail of Tears. Entire communities were displaced from their ancestral lands and moved to unfamiliar and often inhospitable territories. The loss of land was one of the most devastating consequences of colonization, as it destroyed the cultural, social, and economic structures of Native American societies. The disruption of traditional farming, hunting, and gathering practices caused a collapse in many tribes' way of life, and many Native people struggled to survive in the new and often barren environments they were forced to move to. This long history of land theft, forced removal, and violence is a crucial part of the real history of Thanksgiving. The expansion of European colonies and their eventual dominance over native lands and peoples left a legacy of trauma, displacement, and cultural destruction that still affects Native American communities today. The process of colonization did not just end with the arrival of the Pilgrims in 1620. It continued for centuries, fundamentally altering the course of Native American history and shaping the reality that Indigenous peoples face today. As we reflect on this history, it's important to recognize how the narrative of Thanksgiving has been used to obscure these harsh truths. The violence, displacement, and exploitation of Native peoples were often swept under the rug in favor of a more comforting, sanitized story of unity and cooperation. To truly understand the origin and truth about Thanksgiving, we need to acknowledge the full history, the good, the bad, and the painful. Only by doing so can we begin to approach the holiday with the understanding, respect, and awareness that it deserves. The evolution of Thanksgiving into the national holiday we know today is a fascinating journey, one that goes well beyond the 1621 feast or even the colonial period. The holiday we recognize today didn't truly become a national event until well into the 19th century, and its transformation was shaped by politics, culture, and the ways in which history was told, or, in many cases, left untold. The first step in this transformation came in 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln officially declared Thanksgiving a national holiday. This was not a move rooted in historical accuracy or in recognition of the true origins of the holiday. Rather, it was a political decision made during the depths of the Civil War. Lincoln saw Thanksgiving as an opportunity to foster national unity in a time of division and conflict. The country was deeply torn apart by the Civil War, and Lincoln hoped that a day of national Thanksgiving would help to bring people together. At a time when the country was grappling with unimaginable loss and suffering, he called for a day to give thanks for the Union's victories, for the blessings of life, and for the hope of reconciliation. In his proclamation, Lincoln emphasized the importance of gratitude and the need for healing. His words were crafted to appeal to both the northern and southern states, aiming to unite the divided nation. Lincoln's version of Thanksgiving was a day of thanksgiving to God for the blessings of life, a day when Americans would pause and reflect on the strength of their nation despite its deep divisions. This marks a significant shift from the origins of Thanksgiving as a harvest celebration or a political alliance between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. Lincoln's National Thanksgiving did not emphasize the complicated history of colonialism or the impact of European expansion on native populations. Instead, it was a unifying moment for a war-torn nation, and it set the stage for Thanksgiving to become a regular part of American life. After Lincoln's declaration, Thanksgiving became an annual tradition, but it wasn't yet the holiday we know today. It was still not widely celebrated across the country, with some states observing the day and others not. This began to change in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as Thanksgiving slowly became ingrained in American culture. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a controversial move by moving Thanksgiving up 1 week earlier to the third Thursday in November, in an attempt to extend the holiday shopping season and boost the economy during the Great Depression. This change was met with considerable backlash, and in 1941, Congress officially made Thanksgiving the fourth Thursday in November, where it has remained ever since. As Thanksgiving became more ingrained in American culture, its meaning began to shift further. It became less about political alliances, survival, or unity, and more about family gatherings, feasts, and consumerism. The rise of the American food industry, coupled with the growth of the advertising sector, turned Thanksgiving into a massive consumer event, one that was about spending time with loved ones and buying products, rather than reflecting on the deeper meanings of history or society. The image of a happy family gathering around a turkey, with children playing and everyone giving thanks, became the dominant narrative. This sanitized, idealized version of Thanksgiving obscured the darker truths of colonial violence, land theft, and the erasure of Indigenous cultures. One of the most significant ways in which Thanksgiving has evolved over time is in the way it has been taught in schools and portrayed in the media. For many years, the story of Thanksgiving as a peaceful, harmonious gathering between the Pilgrims and Native Americans was the dominant narrative. In textbooks, classrooms, and even popular media, the Thanksgiving story was presented as a moment of mutual understanding and shared bounty. This narrative has roots in 19th century notions of American exceptionalism, where the history of colonization was often glossed over in favor of stories that promoted unity and the melting pot ideal. Thanksgiving became a symbol of harmony between different cultures, when, in reality, the relationships between settlers and Native Americans were far more complex and often fraught with tension, violence, and exploitation. The exclusion of Indigenous perspectives from Thanksgiving narratives is one of the most troubling aspects of the holiday's evolution. For years, Native American voices were either completely absent from Thanksgiving stories or reduced to caricatures and stereotypes. The sanitized version of the Thanksgiving story that has been taught in schools and celebrated in mainstream culture has been overwhelmingly focused on the experiences and perspectives of the settlers, with little attention given to the true history of Native American displacement, trauma, and resistance. This erasure of Indigenous peoples from the Thanksgiving story has continued for generations, as the dominant narrative remains centered on the Pilgrims and their friendly relations with Native Americans, completely ignoring the centuries of violence, land theft, and genocide that followed. This erasure is not accidental. In many ways, it has been a deliberate attempt to downplay the impact of colonization and to create a more comfortable, palatable version of history for mainstream America. By framing Thanksgiving as a day of peace and goodwill, many aspects of Native American history, such as their struggles against colonization, their forced relocation, and their ongoing battles for land and sovereignty, have been marginalized. Indigenous communities have long fought to have their perspectives heard and acknowledged, but their stories have often been ignored or dismissed by the mainstream culture. It wasn't until the 20th century that Indigenous people began to assert their right to speak about their history and experiences, and even now, the true history of Thanksgiving remains a contentious topic in American society. In recent years, there has been growing awareness about the need to address these historical injustices and to create a more inclusive, accurate narrative around Thanksgiving. Many Native American groups and activists have called for a reframing of Thanksgiving, suggesting that it should be a day of reflection, education, and mourning for the impact of colonization. For some Indigenous peoples, Thanksgiving is not a celebration, but a painful reminder of the violence and loss they have endured since the arrival of European settlers. Some Native American communities observe a national day of mourning on Thanksgiving Day, using the occasion to remember their ancestors and raise awareness about the ongoing struggles of Native peoples. As we continue to celebrate Thanksgiving, it's important to remember the complex history behind the holiday. While it's a time for many to gather with family, enjoy a meal, and reflect on what they're thankful for, it's also a time to acknowledge the painful truths of colonization and the ways in which Native American communities have been harmed. In order to move forward, we need to make space for Indigenous perspectives, learn about the true history of Thanksgiving, and commit to actions that support the rights and sovereignty of Native peoples. Only by confronting the full history of Thanksgiving can we truly understand its significance and ensure that we honor the past while building a more just and inclusive future. Native American communities have diverse perspectives on Thanksgiving, and these views are deeply informed by the complex history of colonization, land theft, and the trauma caused by centuries of violence. For many Native Americans, Thanksgiving is not a celebration, but rather a reminder of the injustices they have faced since the arrival of European settlers. While some individuals may choose to observe the holiday as a time for reflection or family gatherings, many Indigenous people view Thanksgiving as a painful reminder of the ongoing consequences of colonization. One of the most significant ways that Native American communities engage with the Thanksgiving holiday is through the observance of National Day of Mourning. This day, held annually on the fourth Thursday in November, is a time for Indigenous people to reflect on the loss of their land, culture, and people due to European settlement. The first National Day of Mourning was organized in 1970 by Native American activists in Plymouth, Massachusetts, to call attention to the historical and ongoing struggles of Indigenous communities. It serves as a counterpoint to the mainstream Thanksgiving celebrations, offering an opportunity to raise awareness about the true history of the holiday and the impact of colonialism on Native peoples. The National Day of Mourning is not only a day of remembrance, but also an act of resistance and reclamation. For many Native Americans, it is a time to honor their ancestors who endured forced removal, violence, and loss. It also serves as a moment to advocate for the rights of Indigenous people today, including issues related to land sovereignty, environmental protection, and the preservation of cultural traditions. The day is marked by speeches, prayers, and community gatherings, where Native American leaders and activists share their perspectives on the history and current struggles of their people. It is a call to acknowledge the painful history of colonization and to work toward justice, healing, and recognition for Indigenous communities. While Thanksgiving is often celebrated as a day of gratitude for Native Americans, it can also be seen as a symbol of the erasure of their history and contributions. The holiday's idealized narrative of pilgrims and Native Americans coming together in peaceful harmony has long been used to justify the actions of European settlers, glossing over the violence and exploitation that followed. This distorted version of history perpetuates myths about Native peoples, often portraying them as passive or submissive in the face of colonization, when in reality they were resilient, resistant, and active participants in shaping their own futures. To gain a deeper understanding of Indigenous perspectives on Thanksgiving and the history of colonization, it is important to seek out resources and voices from Native communities themselves. Many Indigenous leaders, scholars, and activists have written extensively about the true history of Thanksgiving and the ongoing impact of colonization on their peoples. Some key resources include The Inconvenient Truth About Thanksgiving by Adam JPH. This article offers a critical examination of the Thanksgiving holiday from an Indigenous perspective, highlighting the ways in which the holiday erases the experiences of Native peoples and perpetuates harmful stereotypes. The National Day of Mourning website, www.americanindiancenter.org. This site provides information about the history of the National Day of Mourning, along with resources for understanding the significance of the day and its role in challenging the mainstream Thanksgiving narrative. Native American Rights Fund, NARF. NARF is a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the rights of Native Americans. Their website offers educational resources about Native American history, law, and current issues facing Indigenous communities, including resources related to Thanksgiving. Books by Indigenous authors. There are numerous works by Native authors that explore the history of colonization, the impact of Thanksgiving, and the ongoing struggles of Indigenous peoples. Some examples include An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. This book offers a thorough examination of the history of the United States from the perspective of Indigenous peoples, providing a broader context for understanding the origins of Thanksgiving and its impact. The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the Present by David Truer. Truer's book offers a rich history of Native American life in the modern era, covering topics such as the legacy of Thanksgiving and the ways in which Native communities continue to fight for recognition and justice. Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. While not focused specifically on Thanksgiving, Kimmerer's work offers a deep exploration of Indigenous ways of knowing and relating to the land, providing valuable insights into the cultural and spiritual traditions of Native peoples. Native American media outlets. There are a number of Native-run media outlets that offer news, commentary, and analysis from Indigenous perspectives. These outlets often cover topics related to Thanksgiving, Indigenous rights, and the ongoing effects of colonization. Some examples include Indian Country. Today, a national Native American news source that regularly publishes articles and opinions on issues related to Thanksgiving, colonization, and Native American history. Native News Online. This digital news platform covers a wide range of topics related to Indigenous peoples, including the history and cultural significance of Thanksgiving. By engaging with these resources and listening to the voices of Native American communities, we can better understand the true history of Thanksgiving and its implications for Native peoples. It's important to remember that Thanksgiving, while a time of celebration for many, is also a day of mourning and reflection for Indigenous peoples. Acknowledging this complexity and embracing Indigenous perspectives can help foster a more honest and respectful understanding of American history and its ongoing effects on Native communities. As we navigate Thanksgiving in the modern era, we must be mindful of the fact that the history of colonization is not just a distant memory, it is an ongoing process that continues to affect Native peoples today. Thanksgiving presents an opportunity for reflection, for grappling with the difficult truths of our shared history, and for working toward a more just and equitable future for all. Native Americans have long been misrepresented in mainstream Thanksgiving narratives, often being reduced to oversimplified and inaccurate stereotypes. These representations often omit the complexity and richness of Native cultures, portraying them in ways that are both harmful and misleading. When we look at Thanksgiving myths and stories, the dominant imagery is frequently tied to outdated and incorrect ideas about Native peoples, and these misconceptions are perpetuated in both historical portrayals and contemporary celebrations. Stereotypes and misrepresentations in Thanksgiving. Myths. A common depiction of Native Americans in Thanksgiving stories is that of a noble savage, a benevolent, peaceful, and simple figure. This stereotype strips Native peoples of their individuality, diverse cultures, and histories. It also reinforces the idea that Native Americans were passive participants in their own history, failing to recognize their agency, resistance, and complex social and political structures before and after European contact. In many Thanksgiving stories, Native Americans are depicted as wearing feathered headdresses, buckskin clothing, and speaking in stereotypical ways, even though these elements represent only a small fraction of the many different tribes across the continent. Native peoples from various regions and cultures had distinct clothing, languages, and traditions, and reducing them to a uniform, monolithic image is not only inaccurate, but also disrespectful. Modern Thanksgiving celebrations and perpetuated stereotypes. Modern Thanksgiving celebrations continue to perpetuate these stereotypes, often through visuals, cultural symbols, and performances. School pageants, for example, commonly feature children dressed as pilgrims and Native Americans, with the latter typically wearing feathers and face paint. This portrayal glosses over the deep historical complexities and the harsh realities that Native peoples faced, both during the first encounter with European settlers and in the centuries that followed. In some cases, Thanksgiving parades and television specials will include Indian performers, often in costumes that emphasize exoticism rather than authenticity. These portrayals can perpetuate a Hollywood version of Native cultures, one that ignores their real-world struggles, their rich histories, and their contemporary presence. The continued use of these images, often produced without consultation or respect for Native communities, fuels harmful misconceptions. The impact of stereotypes. The perpetuation of these stereotypes can be incredibly harmful. It not only distorts public understanding of Native American cultures, but also contributes to the erasure of their histories and contributions. By focusing on overly simplistic and romanticized representations, these myths can make it difficult for people to fully grasp the true impact of colonization, the history of violence, and the ongoing struggles that Native communities face. For Native Americans, these misrepresentations can feel like a form of cultural appropriation, when their identities and traditions are used as entertainment or commodified for non-Native audiences. Without respect for the culture or context, it diminishes the significance of those traditions. These portrayals can also undermine Native people's ongoing efforts to reclaim their narratives and their voices. How media and individuals can responsibly represent Native American cultures and histories. To combat misrepresentation, it's crucial for individuals and media outlets to approach Native American cultures and histories with respect, authenticity, and a commitment to accuracy. There are several ways this can be done. 1. Consult Native voices and leaders. Whenever telling stories about Native communities, whether in academic settings, media productions, or public discourse, it is important to consult Native American leaders, historians, and cultural experts. Listening to and learning from Native people ensures that their stories are represented in a way that is meaningful, accurate, and aligned with their values. 2. Promote Indigenous perspectives. Media outlets and educational systems should actively work to include Indigenous perspectives in discussions about Thanksgiving and American history. This can be done through articles, documentaries, books, and programs that feature Native American authors, historians, and activists. Supporting Indigenous content creators, filmmakers, and journalists is one way to ensure that Native voices are heard and valued in broader cultural conversations. 3. Move away from harmful stereotypes. To avoid reinforcing harmful stereotypes, media and educational systems should steer clear of visual tropes like feathered headdresses, war paint, and generic Indian costumes. These images don't represent the vast diversity of Native cultures and can perpetuate dangerous ideas about Native peoples. Instead, the focus should be on presenting the real histories, struggles, and contributions of Native communities. 4. Highlight Native resilience and agency. Rather than depicting Native peoples as passive victims of colonization, it's important to highlight their resilience, agency, and active resistance throughout history. Native peoples have continually fought to preserve their land, cultures, and sovereignty. This should be the narrative that is shared, rather than one that glorifies or romanticizes the past. 5. Support Native American initiatives and education. Individuals can also support Native American organizations and educational initiatives that work to teach the true history of Thanksgiving and colonization. By investing in educational programs that elevate Native perspectives, we can begin to undo the centuries of erasure and distortion that have shaped public understanding. 6. Recognize Indigenous rights and sovereignty. Another important aspect of responsible representation is acknowledging the rights and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples today. This includes recognizing ongoing struggles such as land rights, access to health care, and environmental justice. Instead of simply romanticizing the past, responsible media should also address the contemporary realities faced by Native communities, recognizing their ongoing contributions to society and their rightful place within the broader narrative of American history. 7. Encourage cultural exchange and dialogue. Encouraging cultural exchange and open dialogue between Indigenous communities and non-Native populations is another key way to promote responsible representation. By fostering spaces where people can learn about and engage with Native cultures in authentic and respectful ways, we create a more inclusive and accurate understanding of Native peoples and their histories. The representation of Native Americans in Thanksgiving, myths, and modern celebrations is often riddled with inaccuracies and stereotypes. To ensure a more accurate and respectful portrayal of Native American cultures, it is essential to consult Indigenous voices, focus on their agency and resilience, and actively work to undo the damage caused by centuries of misrepresentation. By doing so, we can help create a more inclusive and truthful understanding of Thanksgiving, one that acknowledges the full history of the holiday and the ongoing struggles of Native communities. Modern impact. Thanksgiving has undergone significant commercialization, transforming from a holiday of historical significance into a consumer-driven event. The commercialization of Thanksgiving has altered its meaning, shifting the focus from reflection and gratitude to consumerism and materialism. This shift is evident in the overwhelming presence of Black Friday sales, which have grown to overshadow the actual day of Thanksgiving itself. Stores opening on Thanksgiving evening to offer discounts reflect how the holiday's traditional values of family, gratitude, and remembrance have been eclipsed by the pursuit of profits. The marketing around Thanksgiving encourages people to focus on food, shopping, and entertainment. Advertisements showcase images of the perfect Thanksgiving meal and idealized family gatherings, further promoting an image of consumerism tied to the holiday. While Thanksgiving is still celebrated as a time to gather with family, the materialistic angle often distracts from the deeper historical and cultural layers of the holiday, including the treatment of Indigenous peoples and the impact of colonization. Additionally, Thanksgiving's commercialized nature also feeds into the false narrative of a harmonious feast shared by the Pilgrims and Native Americans. Through ads, movies, and popular media, we are often shown an image of Thanksgiving that glosses over the darker history of the event. For many, this creates a distorted and overly simplistic understanding of the holiday. The teaching of Thanksgiving history. Today, how Thanksgiving is taught in schools has evolved over time, though for many years it has adhered to a sanitized, simplified version of the story. In most classrooms, students are introduced to a story where Pilgrims and Native Americans peacefully share a meal, symbolizing cooperation and mutual respect. This narrative, while positive, often fails to address the historical context of colonization, violence, and the displacement of Native peoples. The legacy of these omissions continues to shape how generations of Americans view Thanksgiving and their country's history. In recent years, there have been efforts to include Indigenous perspectives in the teaching of Thanksgiving, though this remains a work in progress. Some educators and activists are working to shed light on the full history of Thanksgiving, emphasizing the realities of colonial violence and the displacement of Indigenous peoples. There are now resources that help schools provide a more accurate and inclusive narrative, including the history of the Wampanoag tribe, the trauma caused by the arrival of Europeans, and the ongoing impacts of colonization on Native communities. Some educators are using the Thanksgiving holiday as an opportunity to discuss broader issues such as Indigenous rights, cultural preservation, and sovereignty. There is also a growing awareness about the importance of teaching about the National Day of Mourning, which is observed by many Native American groups as a way to remember the painful history of colonization. These initiatives aim to balance the historical significance of Thanksgiving with a critical examination of its implications for Native peoples. However, despite these efforts, the dominant narrative of Thanksgiving as a harmonious celebration of sharing and peace still persists in many classrooms across the United States. This inconsistency in how the holiday's history is taught contributes to a lack of understanding and awareness among students about the ongoing struggles of Indigenous peoples. Ways to celebrate Thanksgiving while honoring Indigenous perspectives. Celebrating Thanksgiving in a way that acknowledges the full history of the holiday and honors Indigenous perspectives requires intentionality and reflection. Here are some ways individuals and families can celebrate while keeping these considerations in mind. 1. Learn about Indigenous history and culture. One of the most powerful ways to honor Indigenous peoples on Thanksgiving is by educating yourself and others about the true history of the holiday. This includes understanding the impact of colonization on Native communities, as well as learning about Indigenous cultures, traditions, and contemporary issues. Many Native American organizations provide educational resources, books, and documentaries that offer valuable insights into these topics. 2. Support Native American businesses and artists. Another way to honor Indigenous communities during Thanksgiving is by supporting Native American-owned businesses and artists. Purchasing items from Indigenous artisans or donating to organizations that support Native communities can be a meaningful way to contribute to Indigenous-led initiatives and celebrate their contributions to society. 3. Acknowledge the land you live on. Many Native American groups encourage people to recognize and honor the land they live on. This can be done by learning about the Indigenous peoples who originally inhabited the land, understanding their history, and offering respect for their continued presence and connection to the land. Some individuals and organizations have taken to acknowledging the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples during their Thanksgiving celebrations, whether through a land acknowledgement or by learning about local tribes. 4. Participate in the National Day of Mourning. For some Native American groups, Thanksgiving is a day of mourning, as it marks the beginning of a long history of loss and colonization. One way to honor this perspective is by learning about and participating in the National Day of Mourning, observed on the fourth Thursday of November in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The event serves as an opportunity to remember the painful history and ongoing struggles of Native peoples, as well as to show solidarity with Indigenous communities. 5. Reflect on the meaning of gratitude. Instead of focusing solely on the traditional narrative of the Pilgrims and their harvest feast, Thanksgiving can be a time to reflect on what gratitude truly means. This includes acknowledging the land, the people, and the history that have shaped us. It's an opportunity to think critically about the values of cooperation and respect, not only in relation to our fellow citizens, but also with regard to the Indigenous peoples whose land we now occupy. 6. Avoid cultural appropriation. During Thanksgiving celebrations, it's important to be mindful of the ways in which Native American cultures are often misrepresented or appropriated. This includes being aware of costumes or decorations that caricature Native peoples, such as wearing Indian costumes or using stereotypical imagery. Respectful representations of Indigenous cultures should prioritize authenticity and avoid perpetuating harmful tropes. 7. Engage in dialogue and advocacy. Another way to support Indigenous communities is by engaging in dialogue and advocacy around Indigenous rights. Whether through social media, community events, or donations to causes that support Native sovereignty, there are many ways to get involved in supporting the political, social, and economic rights of Indigenous peoples. While Thanksgiving remains an important holiday for many Americans, it is crucial to approach it with a deeper understanding of its history and its effects on Indigenous peoples. Celebrating Thanksgiving with awareness and respect for Indigenous perspectives can help foster greater understanding, reconciliation, and solidarity. By incorporating education, support for Native communities, and reflection on the holiday's full history, we can begin to shift the narrative from one of erasure to one of inclusivity and respect. Broader historical context, European colonization in North America had profound and devastating effects on Native populations, leading to a series of events that deeply reshaped the social, political, and cultural fabric of Indigenous communities. From the moment European settlers arrived, the dynamics between Native peoples and Europeans were characterized by violence, disease, and the steady erosion of Indigenous lands and sovereignty. One of the most significant outcomes of European colonization was the widespread loss of life due to disease. Smallpox, influenza, and other diseases brought by Europeans decimated Indigenous populations, wiping out as much as 90% of the Native population in some regions. The lack of immunity to these diseases caused catastrophic death tolls, leaving Indigenous communities vulnerable to further exploitation and colonization. As colonization progressed, Native peoples were increasingly pushed off their ancestral lands. This process of displacement was formalized in numerous ways, including forced removals and the signing of treaties that were often coercive or outright broken by European settlers and later the United States government. One of the most infamous examples of forced relocation is the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. when thousands of Cherokee and other southeastern tribes were forcibly removed from their homelands and sent to designated Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Thousands of Native Americans died during this journey due to harsh conditions, disease, and inadequate supplies. Beyond physical displacement, colonization also led to the forced assimilation of Native peoples. This took many forms, from the establishment of boarding schools designed to strip Native children of their language and cultural practices, to the outlawing of traditional ceremonies and religious practices. The U.S. government and religious missionaries pushed for the civilization of Native Americans, a concept based on the idea that indigenous ways of life were inferior and needed to be replaced with European American customs, religions, and economic systems. This process of assimilation sought to erase Native cultures, identities, and spiritual practices, resulting in generations of Native Americans who were disconnected from their heritage. As for the broader history of colonization, Thanksgiving ties into this narrative of displacement, resistance, and survival. The first so-called Thanksgiving feast, held in 1621 between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, has often been romanticized as a moment of peaceful coexistence. In reality, the feast was part of a larger political alliance between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, driven in part by the Wampanoag's need for allies against rival tribes. While the Pilgrims were in dire straits, struggling to survive in a new land, the Wampanoag were also navigating a precarious situation due to the pressure of European settlers encroaching on their territory. What started as an alliance eventually turned into a long history of conflict as the settlers' demand for land and resources increased. Thanksgiving is often viewed as a symbol of the beginning of this colonial relationship, which would evolve over the next few centuries into a history of displacement, broken treaties, and violence. The celebration of Thanksgiving, then, is intrinsically tied to the broader narrative of European settlers asserting dominance over indigenous peoples and the land. As settlers and later the U.S. government pushed westward, Native Americans faced relentless pressure to give up their lands and adapt to European ways of life. The holiday itself became a tool in this larger colonial project, as it was officially declared a national holiday in the 19th century, during a period when the United States was consolidating its power and expanding westward. Thanksgiving was a way to unify the nation and create a national identity that celebrated American values, while sidelining the painful realities of colonization, violence, and indigenous displacement. Indigenous resistance and resilience. While Thanksgiving is often associated with the peaceful coexistence of Pilgrims and Native Americans, it's essential to understand the broader context of indigenous resistance and resilience. Native Americans did not passively accept colonization. They actively resisted it in various forms. Resistance took many shapes, from military conflicts like King Philip's War, 1675, 1676, which saw the Wampanoag and their allies fighting back against the English colonists, to legal battles over land rights and sovereignty that continue today. Despite the centuries of colonization, Native American communities have not only survived, but continue to thrive. Through the preservation of their cultures, languages, and traditions, indigenous peoples have demonstrated incredible resilience. Many tribes have successfully fought for the return of their lands, the recognition of their sovereignty, and the protection of their cultural heritage. The resistance movements of the 20th and 21st centuries, such as the American Indian Movement, AIM, stand as examples of Native communities asserting their rights and demanding justice. In relation to Thanksgiving, many indigenous groups use the day to highlight their history of survival and resistance. For some, Thanksgiving is a reminder of the ongoing struggle for land, rights, and recognition. The National Day of Mourning on Thanksgiving Day in Plymouth, Massachusetts, is an annual event where Native American activists and supporters gather to protest the legacy of colonization and remember the suffering caused by European settlers. The event also serves as a platform for indigenous communities to raise awareness about current issues they face, such as land rights, access to health care, and environmental justice. By recognizing the broader historical context of Thanksgiving and understanding its connection to colonization, displacement, and resistance, we can better appreciate the complexity of the holiday and the ongoing struggles of indigenous peoples. It's important to acknowledge that Thanksgiving, as we celebrate it today, is not a simple or universally joyous occasion for everyone. For many Native Americans, it is a day of reflection on the history of trauma, survival, and ongoing resistance. Thanksgiving is deeply intertwined with the history of colonization, displacement, and Indigenous resistance. The first Thanksgiving was not an isolated moment of peace, but part of a much larger, complex history that continues to shape the relationship between Indigenous peoples and settlers, and later, the U.S. government. By acknowledging these historical truths and reflecting on their implications, we can approach the holiday with greater awareness, empathy, and respect for the Indigenous peoples who have been impacted by centuries of colonization and whose contributions to society are often overlooked. Ways to educate and reflect. Educating others about the true history of Thanksgiving requires a multifaceted approach that goes beyond the traditional narratives often taught in schools and popular culture. One of the most important ways to begin this education is by encouraging critical thinking and open conversations about history. It's essential to challenge the myths and misrepresentations that have been passed down through generations, and instead focus on the complex realities of colonization, displacement, and Indigenous resilience. One effective method is to share resources and voices from Indigenous communities. Many Indigenous authors, scholars, and activists have written extensively about the true history of Thanksgiving and the broader context of colonization. Books like An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King offer essential perspectives on the history of Native American peoples and their struggles for justice. Additionally, documentaries, podcasts, and articles created by Indigenous filmmakers and writers can provide more accurate representations of Native experiences. Platforms like the Native American Heritage Association and organizations such as the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, also provide educational resources and insights that can be shared with others. Another way to educate is through local community engagement. Hosting events like panel discussions, workshops, or film screenings centered around Indigenous history and the true origins of Thanksgiving can help bring these conversations into the public sphere. Schools, libraries, and cultural centers can invite Indigenous speakers to share their stories and educate the wider community about their cultures, histories, and struggles. These events can help foster empathy and understanding, creating an opportunity for people to listen, learn, and reflect. One powerful tool for raising awareness is social media. Social media platforms provide a space to share articles, videos, and educational content that challenge the dominant narrative about Thanksgiving. Hashtags like #ThanksgivingTruth, #National Day of Mourning, and #LandBack are widely used to promote Indigenous perspectives on the holiday and raise awareness about the true history of the land we live on. In addition to education, acknowledging the land we live on and its original Indigenous caretakers is a meaningful way to reflect on Thanksgiving's broader context. Land acknowledgements are a formal statement that recognizes the Indigenous peoples who have stewarded the land for centuries, long before European settlers arrived. These acknowledgements can be made during gatherings, public events, or even in personal conversations. They are an important step toward recognizing Indigenous peoples' historical and ongoing connection to the land, as well as the ongoing impacts of colonization. Land acknowledgements are not just symbolic gestures, but are part of a broader movement to honor and respect Indigenous sovereignty. To ensure that these acknowledgements are meaningful, individuals can also take the time to research the specific Indigenous nations whose land they inhabit, learn about their history, and listen to their contemporary concerns. In doing so, we move beyond superficial recognition and engage in a more respectful and informed relationship with Indigenous communities. On a more personal level, individuals can take steps to support Indigenous communities and honor their history today. One way to do this is by directly supporting Indigenous-led organizations and causes. There are countless Indigenous groups working on a wide range of issues, from advocating for land rights and environmental justice to promoting Indigenous education and preserving languages and cultures. Donating to these organizations, volunteering with them, or sharing their initiatives with others can make a tangible difference in supporting their work. A key area where individuals can make an impact is in the fight for land back. a movement that seeks to return land to Indigenous nations and communities that were unjustly taken during the colonial period. Supporting land-back initiatives, whether through financial contributions or political advocacy, is a direct way to support Indigenous sovereignty and correct historical wrongs. Another way to support Indigenous communities is by purchasing products and services from Indigenous-owned businesses. This not only helps to create economic opportunities, but also empowers Indigenous people to continue their work in preserving and promoting their cultures. Supporting Indigenous artisans, farmers, and creators ensures that Indigenous voices remain strong in the cultural and economic landscape. Finally, it's important to advocate for the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives in all aspects of society. This includes supporting policies that protect Indigenous rights, voting for representatives who prioritize Indigenous issues, and promote Indigenous voices in media and public discourse. By amplifying Indigenous voices and standing in solidarity with their struggles, we can help to create a more just and equitable future. In summary, effective education about the true history of Thanksgiving requires challenging the mainstream narrative, elevating Indigenous voices, and fostering critical thinking. Acknowledging the land we live on and its Indigenous caretakers is an important way to reflect on the holiday's origins and its ongoing implications. Finally, supporting Indigenous communities through education, advocacy, and direct action helps honor their history and their future. It's essential to approach Thanksgiving with awareness, respect, and a commitment to justice, understanding that this holiday is deeply connected to a complex and often painful history that continues to affect Indigenous peoples today. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to explore the true origin of Thanksgiving with me. I hope this video has provided you with a deeper understanding of the history and context surrounding this holiday, as well as its complexities and the impact it continues to have today. If you found this content valuable, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, whether it's questions, reflections, or anything else you'd like to discuss further. Let's keep learning together and keep this conversation going. Until next time, stay informed, stay respectful, and keep reflecting on the full history of Thanksgiving.